Hello and good evening. I'm Randall Miller, Director of Dance Programming and Special Projects for the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust and co-director of the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival. On behalf of the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust and the Center for Humanities at Carnegie Mellon University, welcome to the final week of Humanities at Home. And so please visit www.trustarts.org/humanities to check out our videos from earlier this month. And this video will also be up after the stream to check out for your viewing pleasure. I'd now like to invite my co-director, David Shumway from the Humanities Center of Carnegie Mellon, to say a few words. Are you there, David?
I'm here, Randall. The Humanities Center at Carnegie Mellon has been pleased and excited to have sponsored the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival since 2015. And we're especially happy to be able to bring you smart talk about stuff that matters today at home. Back to you, Randall.
Thanks, David. And now I'd like to introduce Dan Fitzpatrick from our presenting sponsor, Citizens Bank. Are you there, Dan?
Hello, I'm Dan Fitzpatrick, President of Citizens Bank for the Mid-Atlantic region. I want to thank you all for tuning in to the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival at Home. All of us as citizens are committed to the success of our customers, communities, and local economies, and we're proud to support the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival at Home because it provides meaningful dialogue and connection on our deep cultural richness and diversity right when we need it most. It's often said that challenging times bring out the best in people, and we hope that these interviews with artists, academics, and intellectual innovators working to make Pittsburgh a better place will lead you to think, question, reflect, and aspire to not only understand what's happening in the world around us, but to take meaningful action to help bring about change. So thank you again to the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust for hosting the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival at Home. We're grateful for your leadership in galvanizing us to talk about these critically important issues and look forward to joining the discussion. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan. And thanks to Citizens Bank for their support. Financial support is a critical piece of our ability to produce programs like Pittsburgh Humanities Festival at Home. If any of our viewers out there would wish to make a financial contribution to support this work, please visit www.trustarts.org/supporthumanities. One final note before I introduce our speaker, please be aware that the speaker will take questions from the audience at the end of his presentation. And so drop those comments in either Facebook or YouTube, whichever method you're watching through, and we will get to a few of them at the end of the talk. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Boaz Frankel is a Pittsburgh-based writer and filmmaker. He is also the winner of the 2020 Pittsburgh Humanities Festival Community Open Call. As David and I were envisioning what the digital at-home model of this Humanities Festival would be, we felt it was a critical piece to include the community voices that we seek every year in the festival. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to Boaz, and I'll see you all when we're in the question section. Boaz?
Thanks so much, Randall and David and all the folks over there. So when I was in high school, I took a road trip to the Oregon coast with some friends, and we saw this sign for a garage sale. So we stopped by, and I saw this. It's a mostly wooden box. It has plexiglass on two sides. There's a speaker here. There's a circuit board inside. There's a toggle switch. And when you flip this switch, it makes that sound. There's 4 red buttons. And underneath, there's this LED screen and some lights that blink seemingly at random. There's also an inscription on the side that says, December 1984, handcrafted by Steve Grafton. And the way you're feeling right now is probably similar to the way I felt when I first picked it up at that garage sale 20 years ago. Intrigued, confused, curious. And today I'm going to talk to you about curiosity. And I assume that you love that feeling too. It's invigorating, it's exciting, it's magical, because who knows what this box is, and maybe we're never going to find out, or maybe we are. So I'm going to talk about curiosity, and especially what it means to be curious today, because being curious today is different than it's been in the past. 1,000 years ago, if you were curious about lions, let's say, and you lived somewhere where lions didn't, then you just have to ask every traveler who came through town, or maybe see if anyone knew of a painting of a lion that you could look at. So for reference, here's an illustration of a lion from about 1,000 years ago. So as you can see, they were still trying to figure some stuff out. Now, 100 years ago, if you were curious about lions, you could go to the library or a bookstore or maybe go to a zoo. And today, if you have a question about a lion, you could still go to a zoo or listen to a podcast or get a book or watch a Netflix show about lions. But most likely, you'd probably Google it. Because you can Google everything, which is crazy. You can ask Google, what's the meaning of life? Or what's the meaning of a bunch of other things? Or you could ask Google, what's the most beautiful thing in the world? Or what's the funniest joke ever told? Or what's the funniest South Park episode? Or zodiac sign, according to Google's autocomplete. A lot of people are asking about that too. And Google will always give you an answer, which is even crazier. So what does it even mean to be curious when every answer is just a Google search away? I've always been a curious person, and I think we're all curious people. I know you're curious. In fact, I bet you're curious about that puppet version of me that popped up a second ago. So before we get any further, I guess it's probably a good idea to define the word curious or curiosity. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to let Dr. George Lowenstein define the word for us. He's a professor at CMU, and in a paper he published in 1994, he defined curiosity as a response to an information gap. So that means that we go out into the world and we see something that we don't totally understand, and it makes us realize that there is a gap between what we know and what we want to know. And then curiosity compels us to fill that gap. So today I want to talk about two categories of curiosity that I've been thinking a lot about. Offline curiosity, that's the one where you walk by a lawn bowling club at Frick Park and you wonder what the heck they're doing, and an information gap appears. And then you read the sign, you talk to a bowler, and then you fill that information gap. So that's what I'm calling offline curiosity. And the second category I'm going to talk about is online curiosity. That's where you hear a familiar song, but you can't quite place it. So again, this vast information gap has opened up deep inside your head. So you take out your phone, you open your Shazam app, and you push the button, and there you go. It's Bat Outta Hell by Meatloaf, of course. And now that information gap has been filled. And I was curious about the difference between those two types of curiosity. What are the positives and negatives of each? What are the ramifications of each type of curiosity? So I'm going to talk you through experiences I've recently had with both types of curiosity. So I'm going to start with online curiosity. The other day I was online when I read about Mindy Kaling's new book, which she's publishing with Amazon. And then I remembered her previous book, Is Everyone Hanging Out Without Me? And then I read about how she had just had her second kid, and she didn't even say anything about it until a month after it was born, and she appeared on Stephen Colbert's talk show. So at that point, I was on her Wikipedia page, and I learned that Mindy Kaling and I have something in common. We both have a bachelor's degree in playwriting. How about that? And it's amazing how as you're searching for things online, trying to fill this information gap, you keep creating these other mini information gaps. And since you're already online, you can fill those information gaps too. So that's a recent experience I had with online curiosity. So now I'll tell you about a recent experience I had with offline curiosity. I've got to give you a little background info for this one. So I moved to Pittsburgh almost 2 years ago, and as soon as I moved here, I wanted to find a way to learn more about the city. So I came up with this project called Pittsburgh Stories, in which I would go to each of Pittsburgh's 90 neighborhoods, and I'd make a short documentary in each one. So I'm going to walk you through an example of offline curiosity from the fifth neighborhood I visited, Arlington Heights. So I took the bus to get there, and I started walking the neighborhood, and immediately I noticed that most of the neighborhood was these empty fields, but the fields were fenced off, and it seemed like there used to be something there. Then I noticed this man in a golf cart. He was driving down the street towards me. It seemed like maybe he was working on some sort of maintenance in the area. So I waved at him, and he pulled over for a moment, and he told me that all these empty fields used to be filled with public housing. He said they knocked them down over a decade ago. And it was wild to imagine that these huge fields, now full of all sorts of wildflowers and tall grasses, they were once a neighborhood full of people. So now this information gap was coming into view, and I needed to learn more about this neighborhood that had seemingly disappeared. I just recently learned about this room at the library in Oakland where they keep books and records related to Pittsburgh history. So I went straight there and asked the librarian at the desk for any information they had on Arlington Heights. And she handed me this manila envelope full of cutout articles and old brochures and booklets. And I sat down at one of the tables in the room and I started looking through it all. And I actually found the original sales brochure from when the Arlington Heights development first opened in the 1940s. There were over 600 apartments built for local war workers in the area. But it was still hard to imagine what life in Arlington Heights was really like. And I realized that to get the whole picture, I would need to talk to someone who really lived there. So I wrote down all the names that were mentioned in the articles that I found at the library, and then I searched for those names online, and I was able to track down a few of them. After a few days, I heard back from Ramad Brooks. Back then, he was a 17-year-old quoted in a 1990 article in the Pittsburgh Press about the difficulties of being a black teenager in the neighborhood. Now it was 30 years later, and Ramad met me at a park a few blocks from Arlington Heights. He told me about how he had lived in the public housing there for about 20 years, and suddenly the neighborhood was being brought to life with his stories. He told me about the candy shop called The Cavity, where all the kids used to hang out. He told me about the epic football games they'd play on snow days. And then he described the community day that they would host every summer with the whole neighborhood. And they would transform it into this magical festival full of balloons and music. And he also told me about how in the late 90s and early 2000s, the city demolished 20 of the 27 apartment buildings and displaced over 100 families. Afterward, I checked online for photos of Arlington Heights, and I couldn't even find one. The only way to hear these stories was by asking the people who lived there. And if you are curious, you can see the full video I made with Ramad at pghstories.com. And thinking back about these two curiosity journeys, one in which I researched the recent works of Mindy Kaling and the other in which I explore Arlington Heights, I started thinking of the byproducts of these journeys. So when I went to Arlington Heights, I walked about 3 miles in the area. While I was there, I got curious about all the wildflowers and the empty lots, so I looked into those a bit. I met and talked with a maintenance worker. I discovered a new room at the library, talked with 2 librarians there. I met Ramad Brooks and his grandchildren too. So I'd say that curiosity journey was pretty productive. And when I looked into Mindy Kaling, I did a few Google searches and visited about a half dozen websites. And in both these situations, I was able to find answers to fill that information gap. But it's immediately clear that these lists, looking at these lists, that one of these journeys seemingly had much more meaningful repercussions. Obviously, I'm not the first person to think about different types of curiosity. And while I was doing the research for this presentation, I found this book, appropriately called Curious, by a British journalist named Ian Leslie. And Ian writes about 2 kinds of curiosity, though he has fancier names for them. Epistemic curiosity is about this deeper quest for knowledge. So let's say you want to understand quantum physics or figure out how to start a cactus garden. So this is what I'd been referring to as offline curiosity. And then there's diversive curiosity, this quick kind of curiosity that happens when we're attracted to something new or novel. A Google search falls into the diversive curiosity category. And diversive curiosity almost feels like this itch that you need to scratch. So essentially, that's what I'd been thinking about as online curiosity. And I knew anecdotally that offline or epistemic curiosity felt much more rewarding, but so far I've only shared anecdotal evidence, and I wanted to learn more about how these 2 types of curiosity affect us. So how do the ways in which we express our curiosity actually affect our curiosity? So I did a Google search. Just kidding, I didn't. I checked out a bunch of books from the library, and I read some science journals and some news articles, and I wanted to tell you about 4 surprising things that I learned about offline versus online curiosity. So the first thing has to do with search engine technology, which is constantly changing. And in the New York Times article from 2017, they write about Google's plan for the future of search. So this is from the article. The future that the company sketched out was one in which people communicate with their Google device by talking to them rather than typing. And the machine will anticipate trouble with your asking, trouble without your asking. And that all sounds fancy and seamless, but in an article for The Guardian a few years back, a journalist asked Google's head of search whether that increased accuracy that Google's working on has made us better at asking questions. And the head of search replied that, actually, it works the other way. The more accurate the machine gets, the lazier the questions become. So why is that? Why does a more efficient search engine make us worse at searching and, in a sense, less curious? So that brings me to the second thing I learned from this other scientist, Robert Bjork. He's a cognitive scientist at the University of California, and he was curious about this phenomenon a few decades ago. He conducted these experiments where two groups of people would be instructed to study texts or paintings or other pieces of content. But for one group, he'd make it a little easier to study the information. So maybe he's going to give a quiz to these two groups after they read the same piece of text, but he gives one of the groups this summarized outline, sort of like a cheat sheet. And you'd think that having the outline would help, but it turns out that the group without the outline actually understood the text better, because without the outline, they had to grapple with the text a little more. And Dr. Bjork came up with this term, desirable difficulties, to explain that the harder you work to learn something, or the more friction that there is, the more likely you are to really comprehend the information. So let's say you're curious about snakes, and you've got this information gap. What's the biggest one? What's the most venomous snake? And you want to fill that information gap. So you fill it with a quick Google search on your phone, maybe, and is what essentially a frictionless way. And because of that, you're less likely to retain that information, which means that you're also less likely to build on that information. But if you check out a book from the library about snakes, and you call a local pet store, and then you watch a National Geographic documentary, and then you go to the local reptile show, and then you start breeding ball pythons, well, then maybe you've gone too far. But I think there's a sweet spot. And though a Google search might feel initially satisfying, I think in the end we suffer when we limit our curiosity to internet searches, because curiosity begets more curiosity. I'll give you a personal example. So over the pandemic, like a lot of people, I think, I've been spending a lot of time in the garden, and I've been noticing a lot of weeds. And since I'm in the garden every day, it starts when I see these tiny little seedlings. And at that point, you don't know what they are. But as they grow, they'll start growing these sort of more and more of the recognizable features. So maybe you'll see that the leaves are arranged opposite, or whether they're staggered. And at first, I was using this app on my phone to identify the weeds. But it wasn't always accurate, because as the weed was growing, it might identify it as mallow today, and then ground ivy the next day, and then the next day after that, it thinks it's colt's foot. And as a relatively new weed enthusiast, I didn't have enough information to figure out exactly which weed it was. So I bought this book, The Weeds of North America, over 800 pages of all the weed information that you never thought you needed to know. And you'd think that this was the end. Now I have all the weed info I need. But in fact, it's just the beginning, because now, looking at the book, I realized that every invasive weed came to this country in a new, fascinating way. Colt's foot, which I have in my backyard, was brought to America because people used it as a cold remedy. And the Puritans brought dandelions here because they were a part of their regular diet. They were eating the flowers, they were making salad with the new leaves, making tea with the roots. And other invasive plants were brought here for cattle feed, or because they were popular garden plants in England. And some plants came here on the same ships that carried enslaved people from Africa. The more I learned about weeds, the more I realized that weeds sort of become this whole other lens through which I can view the entire world. And on this plant-centric journey of epistemic curiosity, I did use the internet a few times, but I didn't let my journey be defined by the internet. I also spent a lot of time in my yard just looking at weeds. And it's confusing to me that the internet is this vast hold of information, and yet it can be a pretty uninspiring place too. And I'm not the only one who feels that way, which brings me to the third interesting thing I learned. James Evans is a sociologist at the University of Chicago. I read about him in that book, Curious, and Dr. Evans assembled a database of 34 million scholarly articles that were published between 1945 and 2005. He looked through all the citations in these articles to see if he could see a shift from the pre-internet era to the internet era, because you would think that once these scholars had access to the internet, to all these digitized papers and journals online, that they would be pulling from and citing more sources than ever before. After all, it's so much easier to do a digital search for a specific term than it would have been to go to a library and go through old journals or pull out the microfiche. But instead, Dr. Evans found that in the internet age, scholars were citing fewer articles than they ever had before. It's led to what he calls a narrowing of science and scholarship. And he thinks that this might be because of how search engines work. Because when you do a Google search, there are some things that are always going to be at the top of the list and some things that are going to be hidden at the bottom. So popular articles and links just end up getting more and more popular because everyone's more likely to visit their top search results. Dr. Evans says that now researchers are less likely to find these other articles that are marginally related to their work, whereas a few decades ago, they probably would have seen them while flipping through a science journal. So Not only are we not using the internet well, when Google tries to make it easier to use, it makes us worse at asking questions and being curious. Something's not working, and there are other problems with taking your curiosity online, which brings me to the fourth thing I learned in my research. Curiosity is a powerful thing, and all those big online entities know it. So naturally, they're trying to profit off of our online curiosity. Whenever you visit a website or Facebook or Twitter, there's a barrage of content that's been tailored to play to your specific curiosity. Do you like cat videos or cookie recipes or pranks? They know what you're curious about, and they're using that kind of content to make sure that you stay on their website or platform. So, for example, here are just a few ways that various online entities were vying for my curiosity recently. And it's weird that when I try to be curious on the internet, giant tech companies are trying to use my own curiosity to distract me. And when I do take their bait and click on 10 great kitchen hacks, I'm never going to be satisfied. Those hacks are never good. I'm not saying that there are no distractions when you're pursuing offline curiosity. There are tons, but they're different. They might involve stumbling across a random book at the library, or watching a bird in the park, or talking to a stranger, or calling a gardening hotline. And I think those kinds of distractions can be positive. A few months ago, before the pandemic, I was browsing at a bookstore when I found this book, How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell. And Jenny's not suggesting you become lazy when she says do nothing. She's talking about being more present and living more locally and ignoring all the electronics around you. And I thought she summed up my thoughts really beautifully in this quote. For some, there may be a kind of engineer's satisfaction in the streamlining and networking of our entire lived experience, and yet a certain nervous feeling of being overstimulated and unable to sustain a train of thought lingers. Though it can be hard to grasp before it disappears behind the screen of distraction, this feeling is in fact urgent. We still recognize that much of what gives one's life meaning stems from accidents, interruptions, and serendipitous encounters, the off time that a mechanistic view of experience seeks to eliminate. Because here's the thing, the most magical thing to me about offline curiosity is you never know where it'll lead you, or whom it will lead you to, or the path with which it'll lead you. On the flip side, when you engage in online curiosity, you know exactly where it'll lead you, to another website. So I'm going to leave you with a couple suggestions for you to exercise your offline curiosity. And because of the era we're in, some of these will also include using an electronic device a bit too. So number one, download iNaturalist or Seek. These are apps that help you identify plants. You take a photo and it tells you what plant you're looking at. I think it's really empowering to be able to recognize the plants around you, and it gives you a new perspective on your neighborhood. Like maybe you realize the plants on your street are totally different from the plants 2 streets over, and that might make you even more curious. Number two, go to historicpittsburgh.com and look up historic photographs and maps of your neighborhood. Look up your street, put in your address. Now go out there and see what's changed and what's still the same. And here's a totally offline one. The next time you're waiting for something, for a meeting, or for your water to boil, or for someone to call you back, don't look at your phone. Just look around. Notice the furniture and how it's made, or do you see any birds outside? Or maybe take a closer look at those fancy stamps that are pressed into the sidewalk by the people who poured the cement. Number 4, challenge yourself to go on a short walk without a phone every day. I do this every morning when I walk our dog Kit. And it's okay if it's only a 5-minute walk. You might be surprised by what kind of information gaps might present themselves when you spend 5 minutes walking without the potential distractions of a phone. So thanks so much for spending your evening with me. And I can only assume that since you just attended the 20-some minute talk on curiosity, you must be pretty curious people. So you better have some questions to ask right now. Otherwise, we're all, I think, going to be really embarrassed. So Randall, do any folks out there have any questions?
There are. I'm going to steal one point for clarification for myself as I was listening to you talk, if that's okay. So what is the primary difference between online and offline research? I ask because you cited examples like watching a documentary. And so if I watch a documentary on how to make shoes on YouTube or Netflix, for example, does that count as online or offline curiosity?
Well, I'll start by giving the caveat that I made up these categories, so they're very loose terms. But I think if you're spending a little time with it, it counts in this offline, or really this epistemic curiosity. If you're spending a little time with it, because I think you can do some serious research on Wikipedia too. If you get into like medieval architecture, you could really be like learning a lot of things in there. But I think it's important that you don't confine your interest or curiosity online. But certainly, if you watch a documentary about shoemaking or whatever for an hour, I think that's pretty legit. I would say that's more than just diversive curiosity. You're doing more than just like scratching the itch.
So it's the depth of the research as opposed to like the source per se.
Yeah, I think it's to let yourself go a little further with things and do more than just scratch the itch and find like, oh, what was the name of that sitcom from the 80s? And it was at the airport, more than just like answering those questions, but ask some sort of deeper, bigger questions that you attempt to answer.
Great. Thank you. I'll go right into our next question. In the era of COVID and closed libraries, do you have any suggestions for following curiosity offline?
Gosh, great question, Amanda. So it's funny because I was supposed to give this talk, in March when I was supposed to just be in a theater full of people and would be talking. And it was interesting to look at it again and revisit it. And I think that's why I was so drawn to the garden and like my own space and seeing like, well, how can I be curious in this block that I live in? And so I think that's why my interest was drawn so much to weeds, because there's like a lot to be curious about. And then like there are weird things I discovered and I'm like, oh, I can eat this hairy bittercress that's growing in my yard. And then like, okay, it doesn't taste that good, but it's edible. Like that's an interesting thing. So I think there's endless things you can be curious about within your house, the room you're in, and certainly your neighborhood. But I think the natural world is like a great place to do like, plant a seed, plant a bean, see what happens.
Great. Next question is, what sparked your curiosity about curiosity?
Gosh, thanks for the question, Paige. Okay, I'll tell you really what made me think about this the first time, and this used to be in the original talk I was giving, and then I cut it out. But I was walking down the street in Squirrel Hill, and I noticed there was this like flock of little brown birds, which I feel like we all know as a category of birds, just those little brown ones that are sort of non-specific and not super interesting. And I was looking at them a little closer, and I realized like that's not one kind of bird. I could see like that's actually three kinds of birds in that like flock of birds. Like one of them has a much little narrower beak and they're sitting in different ways. And some of them perch sort of sideways on the tree. And I just sort of had this realization that like this whole time I'd been walking through and just counting this category of little brown birds. But suddenly if I spent 3 minutes looking at them a little closer, I was like, I'm looking at three different kinds of birds. And then I like rushed home and found a bird identification book. I'm like, oh my gosh, these are three totally different kinds of birds. And they have slightly different diets too. And they prefer different places to build a nest. And so that little moment of when I just spent like 2 minutes looking at something I generally wouldn't look at and realized there was this whole world, I think sort of like cracked it open for me.
Awesome. Next question. This is seasonal. Given the Halloween season, what is your spookiest, creepiest offline discovery about Pittsburgh or elsewhere?
Gosh, great question, Sam. Okay, well, if this is easy. People do Halloween decorations like I have never seen in Pittsburgh. It is wild. We walked by a house last night that had projections in every single window. And some of the projections were like of a fake spooky library that was like pretend inside their house, but wasn't really. It was just like this giant screen they'd put in their window. And the other one had like this creepy doll that like seemed to be moving. And the other one had this giant eyeball that kept blinking. So the thing I'm curious about is like, what is it about Pittsburgh? Or maybe it's a COVID specific thing that people are trying to just bring more pleasure to people walking by in the street. But Pittsburgh does Halloween decorations in a way I've never seen before. And I'm impressed by it.
Awesome. All right. So that's all we have time for this episode. I want to thank you, Boaz, for being here. One more thing before we go. Where is there a good place for? Oh, you see it's below. So we found it. Stuffbyboaz.com. And thanks so much. And I know that this talk was inspiring for me, and I hope and know that the people who watch it at home will be inspired to continue further conversations and hopefully get out and explore some offline curiosity. Before I go, I have to make one more plea to please consider making a financial contribution to support the mission and future programming at www.trustarts.org/supporthumanities. Thank you for joining us this month for Pittsburgh Humanities Festival at Home, and have a good night. Thank you.